Donovan, careful on that ice. The words left my mouth the same instant I heard the crack, not the ice, not the dock, but something wooden, giving way beneath my son-in-law's boot. Except he wasn't near any ice. He was 6 feet behind my daughter, and his hand was at her back. I saw it before my brain could make sense of it. That half-second where your eyes register something and your body moves before the thought forms. Tessa's arms flew out, her mouth opened. And then she was over the railing of the boat deck, gone into the black water of Lake Coeur. I was running before she hit the surface. She slipped, Donovan said. His voice was calm. Too calm for a man who'd just watched his wife go into 40-degree water at 11 in the evening. Oh God, Tessa. Somebody help. The theatrical panic came 3 full seconds after she went in. I counted. Old habit. I hit the railing at the stern and looked down. The water was black and cold, and Tessa was thrashing, disoriented. The dock lights caught the white of her face. She couldn't swim well, never could, not since she was small, which was why I'd spent every summer of her childhood trying to fix that and never quite managing it. She knew enough to stay alive for maybe 2 minutes in water that cold. Maybe. I went in after her. I'm 64 years old. My knees tell me about it every morning when I get out of bed. And my left shoulder has had the same ache in it since 1987. But I've been in colder water than Lake Coeur in November. And I've done it on purpose, and I've done it in the dark, and both times I came back up. She was 8 feet from the boat when I reached her. I got my arm under hers and pulled. She was gasping, already going rigid from the cold. I towed her to the swim ladder at the stern and got her hands on the rungs and talked her up 1 step at a time while the cold wrapped around my chest like a fist. Donovan was at the top of the ladder when we came over. He helped pull Tessa onto the deck and immediately wrapped a towel around her, making all the right noises. I stood there dripping on the fiberglass and watched his face over her shoulder. His eyes found mine. Just for a second. And what I saw there wasn't relief. It was calculation. I'd worn that look myself once. A long time ago, in rooms where the wrong expression could get people killed. I knew exactly what it meant. He was measuring, recalculating, figuring out what my surviving this night changed about whatever came next. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Not really. They saw a retired civil engineer from Spokane who drove a 10-year-old pickup and spent his weekends fixing the dock on his lake property. They saw a quiet widower who'd lost his wife to cancer 4 years ago and had been slowly going soft ever since. A man who loved his daughter and tolerated her husband because that was what you did. They didn't know that before I'd spent 22 years calculating load-bearing tolerances and drainage grades. I'd spent 11 years doing something else entirely. Something the government still doesn't like to discuss in public forums. They didn't know about the other things I could calculate. Inside, I got Tessa dry and into blankets on the couch. Her lips were still bluish. Donovan hovered nearby, solicitous and warm, bringing her tea and touching her hair. I sat across from them and kept my breathing steady and let the cold work its way out of my joints and thought about the life insurance policy I'd found 3 months ago. Not by snooping. She'd asked me to help her sort through their files when they were doing their taxes, said Donovan had made a mess of the organization system and she couldn't find the mortgage documents. I'd found the policy in a manila folder between the car registration and a Costco receipt. $2.4 million. Tessa listed as insured. Donovan as sole beneficiary. Taken out 14 months ago, amended 8 months ago to increase the coverage amount, and carrying a special rider that excluded payout for suicide but said nothing about accidents. I'd memorized the policy number, the carrier, the agent's name. I put it back exactly where I found it. I hadn't said a word. The boat trip had been Donovan's idea. A weekend on the lake before the marina closed for the season, just the 3 of us. Tessa had been delighted. She'd been working too hard, Donovan said. She needed to decompress. She nearly decomposed instead. You should get dry too, Dad, Tessa said from her cocoon of blankets. Her teeth had stopped chattering. That was something. Donovan, can you get my dad a towel? Donovan went to the cabin. I looked at my daughter. She had her mother's colouring. That particular shade of auburn that went copper in the summer and dark as mahogany in winter. She was 31 years old, and she was alive because I'd been watching the wrong thing at the right time. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Embarrassed." She managed a small smile. "I can't believe I went over like that. I must have caught my foot on something." I nodded, looked at the railing where she'd gone over. The latch on the gate section was broken. I'd noticed it when we bought it and meant to mention it to the rental company. Now I looked at it again more carefully. The pin wasn't worn through. It was sheared. Clean. This wasn't the first time I'd seen hardware fail on purpose. Donovan came back with a towel and a dry flannel shirt of his own. Generous. Solicitous. His hand on my shoulder as he gave them to me. "Crazy night," he said. "Thank God you were right there." "Yes," I said. "Thank God." He smiled at me. I smiled back. And while I smiled, I was doing what I'd been trained to do 35 years ago in a facility outside of Fort Meade, Maryland. I was cataloguing everything. The broken latch. The timing of his reaction. The serving the calculation before the theatrical panic. The way he positioned himself behind her on the deck, not beside her, not in front. Behind. There was a word for what Donovan was planning. Several words, actually. But the clearest one was methodical. That night, after Tessa had fallen asleep and Donovan had retired to the master cabin, I sat at the small table in the bow and made 2 calls. The first was to a number I hadn't dialed in 9 years. It rang 4 times, which was 2 more than it used to. And then a woman's voice said simply, "Keen." "It's Alderman," I said. "I need a records pull, nothing official, just background." A pause. "Donovan Schreier." Another pause, longer. "Personal or professional?" "Personal. He married my daughter." The silence stretched. Vivian Keene had been my section chief for 6 years. She knew exactly what it meant when I used that tone of voice. 24 hours, she said. "Same email." "New one. I'll send it." I hung up and sent the address from a burner account I'd set up 3 months ago, when I first found the policy. The second call was shorter. My nephew Craig, who ran a marine salvage operation out of Sand Point. I asked him to come by the marina in the morning before we checked in to return the boat, just to have a look at something. I told him it was probably nothing. He knew me well enough not to believe that. In the morning, Tessa was better. Colour back, laughing about her graceless swan dive, accepting Donovan's fussing with the ease of a woman who believed she was loved. It hurt to watch. It hurt more than the cold had. Craig arrived at 8:30. I met him on the dock while Donovan was inside making breakfast and Tessa was in the shower. I showed him the railing. He didn't touch it. He took 3 photos from different angles, looked at the sheared pin for about 15 seconds, then straightened up and looked at me. "That's not where," he said. "No. No. You want me to call Tom?" Tom Ferreira was his contact at the county sheriff's office. Known him since their boys played Little League together. "Not yet. I need a few days. But I want you to email those photos to me tonight and keep copies for yourself." Craig looked at the boat, looked at me. "Tessa okay?" "She will be." He left without asking anything else. We returned the boat, drove back to Spokane, and I hugged my daughter in the driveway of her house and watched Donovan put his arm around her waist and wave at me from the porch, and I drove home feeling the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. Vivian's file came through the next afternoon. Donovan Schreier, 40 years old. Born in Tacoma, grew up in Olympia. First marriage at 26 to a woman named Peg Norris. Divorced after 3 years. Second marriage to a woman named Clarice Whitfield in his early 30s. She died in a hiking accident in the Columbia River Gorge. Fall from a viewpoint. Ruled accidental. He'd collected on a life insurance policy, $900,000, the maximum he'd been able to get approved. Then he'd moved to Spokane and met my daughter. I read the file 3 times. Then I poured 2 fingers of bourbon, which I almost never do anymore, and sat at the kitchen table and thought about Clarice Whitfield, who had also not been able to swim well, according to a feature article in the Oregonian about the accident, who had also gone over a railing, who also had a husband who was standing right behind her when it happened, and who was described by witnesses as devastated. 3 seconds. I wondered if he'd waited 3 seconds with her too. The next morning I called my daughter and asked if she'd come for Sunday dinner. Just the 2 of us. I told her I'd make her mother's pot roast, which I had never once successfully replicated, but which I kept attempting because trying felt better than not trying. She came alone. Donovan had a golf thing, she said. I said that was fine. Over dinner, I asked her about the insurance policy. I kept my voice level. I told her I'd found it when we sorted the files, that I hadn't wanted to say anything without understanding it first, that I was probably being an overprotective old fool. I watched her face as she processed the question. Oh, that, she said. Donovan set that up when we were talking about the future. He said it made sense to have good coverage on both of us while we're still young enough for good rates. She shrugged. There's one on him, too. I'm his beneficiary. Can I ask, whose idea was the higher coverage amount? A slight pause. Almost nothing. He'd read something about how much coverage made sense given our income. He had a spreadsheet. She smiled a little. You know how he is with spreadsheets? I knew how he was with spreadsheets. I also now knew that the policy on Donovan's life, which I'd confirmed through Vivian's contacts, was for $300,000, not $2.4 million, and that the disparity between those numbers was not a coincidence, and was not about favorable premium rates for young, healthy applicants. I didn't say any of this to Tessa. What I said was, I'm glad you're happy, sweetheart. I just wanted to understand. You know me. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You worry too much, Dad. I know, I said. Lifelong condition. After she left, I made the rest of my calls. Tom Ferreira, through Craig. An informal conversation off the record about the Columbia River Gorge case and whether anyone had looked closely at Donovan's finances around the time of Clarice Whitfield's death and in the months before. Vivian again, with a specific request, Donovan's movements over the past 6 months, cross-referenced with any records pools on Tessa's policy carrier. And finally, a call to my own insurance agent, a man I'd worked with for 20 years, asking for guidance on what happened to a life insurance policy if the named beneficiary was under criminal investigation at the time of the insured's death. I wasn't paranoid. I was building a structure. And in my experience, if a structure looked sound at the foundation level, you kept building until you either reached the roof or found where it was going to fail. 2 weeks later, the structure was solid. Donovan had taken out additional coverage on Clarice Whitfield 4 months before her death. He'd researched viewpoints in the Columbia River Gorge with low foot traffic the same week. A credit card charge from a hardware store appeared in his records 9 days before she died. A receipt that included, among other items, a half-inch cold chisel. The same type of tool that would leave a shear mark on a marine latch pin that the average person would mistake for metal fatigue. Tom Ferreira was no longer making this call off the record. I met him in person at a diner in Post Falls, with Craig beside me and a folder of everything I'd assembled. The Oregonian article. The insurance records. Vivian's background file, stripped of anything that would raise questions about how I'd obtained it. The photos from Craig's phone, the marina rental records placing Donovan on that specific boat, my written account of what I'd seen from the stern deck in the 3 seconds before Tessa went over the railing. Tom read everything carefully. He was quiet for a long time. You know I'm going to have to ask how you got some of this, he said. Most of it is public record if you know where to look, I said. The insurance information came from sources I'll describe if the case goes to trial and a judge requires it. Everything in that folder is accurate. And the shear mark on the latch? Craig's photos. I can show you exactly which pin on the rental boat. It hasn't been back out on the water. I checked with the marina. It's in dry storage. Tom looked at Craig, who nodded. All right, Tom said. He closed the folder. I'm going to need to make some calls of my own. This is going to take a few weeks to do properly. In the meantime, he looked at me. Your daughter can't know. I know. And she can't be alone with him. I know that too. I've been managing that for 2 weeks already. Sunday dinners that somehow always ran late. A story about renovating the guest bathroom that meant Tessa was coming to my house 3 evenings a week to help pick tile. A minor plumbing emergency at their house that I insisted on being present to oversee. Donovan found my attentiveness touching. He said so. Twice. Said it was good that Tessa had a father who was so involved. He had no idea. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. The hardest part was sitting across from him at Tessa's dining room table, eating her cooking, listening to him talk about his work and their plans for a trip to Portugal in the spring, and keeping my face exactly neutral, keeping the warmth in my voice when I addressed him. Watching him touch her hand and tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear and be the kind of husband that makes a woman feel chosen. And knowing what I knew, I thought about Clarice Whitfield during those dinners, what her table had looked like, whether she'd been as happy as Tessa seemed, whether someone had been watching and hadn't said anything. I wasn't going to be that person. 3 weeks after my meeting with Tom, on a Tuesday afternoon in January, Donovan was arrested in the parking lot of the gym he went to every morning. 2 detectives from the county and 1 from the Oregon State Police who had reopened the Whitfield case. Tessa called me 45 seconds after it happened. I was already in my truck, 2 miles from her house. I'd like to say I had the right words ready. I didn't. I sat with her on her couch for 4 hours and I let her go through everything. The disbelief, the rage, the humiliation, the grief for something she was losing that she hadn't known was already rotten. I didn't tell her what I'd been doing for the past 6 weeks. Not that night. That night she just needed someone to be there. The next morning, I made coffee and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. That surprised me. Tessa had always been the kind of person who interrupted. Quick-mind, couldn't wait for the end of a sentence. But she sat perfectly still in the kitchen chair with her hands wrapped around her mug and let me go from the beginning to the end without a word. When I finished, she said, "You didn't tell me because you thought I might tip him off. I thought you might not believe me, and I thought if I was wrong, I'd have hurt you for nothing. We were not sure you were right." I thought about the file, the cold chisel receipt, the shear mark on the pin, the 3 seconds. After the first week, no. She looked at her coffee. Clarice Whitfield. Yes. Yes. He did the same thing to her. That's what the Oregon investigation believes. The evidence there is older, but it's consistent. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "Dad, how did you know? I mean, really, how did you know to watch that carefully?" Most fathers would have said she slipped and called it a night. I'd been thinking about how to answer that question for 6 weeks. I used to do work, I said carefully, that required me to notice things other people were inclined to miss. I was good at it. I tried to leave it behind when I retired, but some things don't leave. What kind of work? The kind the government doesn't put on press releases. She looked at me differently then. The way Henry had looked at his grandfather in a hospital room in Montana, I imagine. Reassembling someone you thought you knew. The consulting thing after the engineering firm, she said slowly. When I was in college and you were always traveling. That wasn't engineering, was it? Sometimes it was. She almost laughed. Not quite. The trial was 14 months later. Donovan's defense tried to argue that the Lake Coeur incident was a genuine accident and that my account was colored by grievance, the classic protective father theory, a man who'd never liked his son-in-law and saw what he wanted to see. They did not make this argument effectively. Tom Ferreira's testimony about the latch pin was methodical and unimpeachable. The Oregon detective's presentation of the Whitfield case was devastating. And Vivian, who appeared in court under her current official title, which I won't reproduce here, but which caused an audible stir in the gallery, testified about the factual basis of the background investigation in terms so precise that the defense attorney stopped cross-examining her after 4 questions. Donovan did not testify on his own behalf. The jury was out for 9 hours. When they came back, they found him guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the Whitfield case, and 1 count of attempted murder for Tessa. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. I watched from the second row. Tessa sat beside me, her hand in mine, and didn't look away when the verdict was read. After the sentencing, we stood on the courthouse steps in the January cold, and Tessa said she wanted to go somewhere warm for dinner, somewhere with bad lighting and good pasta, and I said that sounded right to me. Over dinner, she asked me if I was going to teach her some of what I knew. She said it directly, no preamble. "I want to know how to see what you see." I'd put my fork down. Why? Because I had 4 years of information sitting in front of me, and I read it all wrong, she said. The spreadsheets, the insurance conversations, the reason he always positioned himself near exits and railings when we were somewhere elevated. I thought that was just him being cautious. She looked at me steadily. I don't want to be that undefended again. I studied my daughter. 32 now, a year harder than she'd been before, but not broken by it. Still fundamentally the person I'd raised. Warm-hearted, direct, quicker to trust than I'd ever been. The last quality was mostly a virtue. It had almost gotten her killed. "I'll teach you what I can," I said. "But we do it my way. What's your way?" "You learn to see clearly without learning to see everything as a threat. There's a difference between awareness and suspicion. One protects you, the other just makes you miserable." She considered this. "And you've managed that balance?" "Most days." She reached across the table and clinked her glass against mine. "Then that's what I want." We talked through dinner and past closing, and the waitress, a college kid who reminded me a little of Tessa at 20, refilled our coffee twice without being asked, clearly willing to let us stay as long as we needed. Outside, the sidewalk was glazed with ice, and I steadied Tessa on the steps down to the street, and she laughed and said, "If I fall, you'll catch me." "That's always been the plan," I said. She tucked her arm through mine, and we walked to the car in the cold, and I felt the particular quiet that settles in after something enormous has passed through your life and left it standing. Not unchanged, not easy, but standing. There's a version of that night where I don't see the 3 seconds, where I believe what Donovan needs me to believe, and file the railing failure under bad luck and go home and spend the rest of my life not knowing. I thought about that version more than is probably healthy. I don't live in that version. I live in the one where I watched a man's face in the moment between what he'd done and what he needed people to think he felt. And I recognized what I saw because I was trained to recognize it. And I did something about it because she is my daughter, and she was 12 years old when her mother was first diagnosed, and she used to crawl into my bed on the bad nights, and I told her, every single time, that I would handle it. Some promises you make before you know what they'll cost. You keep them anyway. I keep coming back to the latch pin. That small piece of sheared metal on a rental boat on Lake Coeur that most people would have glanced at and walked past. It was maybe an inch long, and it was the difference between my daughter being alive and my daughter being a closed casket and a life insurance payout, and Donovan on a flight to Portugal 6 months later with someone new. The thing about doing wrong to people, real calculated wrong, the kind Donovan planned across months with spreadsheets and hardware store receipts, is that it requires you to believe the people around you are not paying attention. It requires their blindness. He had counted on mine. He looked at a retired man with a bad shoulder and a 10-year-old truck, and saw exactly what he needed to see. Someone who would grieve cleanly and not ask questions. What he didn't account for was that I had spent years being paid to notice what people decided not to show. And more than that, what he couldn't have known was that I had made a promise to a 12-year-old girl sitting in a hospital chair next to her mother's bed, and that promise had never had an expiration date attached to it. I think about what it takes to become someone who can do what Donovan did. It isn't something that happens overnight. It's a slow erosion. Every time we choose the convenient lie over the uncomfortable truth, every time you treat another person as a variable in your own equation rather than someone with their own weight and history and grief, you sand something down in yourself. By the time Donovan stood behind my daughter on that boat deck, he had been sanding for years. That's not a mystery. That's cause and effect, plain and simple. And the reverse is also true. The reason I saw the 3 seconds wasn't luck. It was the accumulated result of decades of choosing to stay sharp, to keep learning, to stay honest with myself about what I was seeing, even when it would have been easier not to. Tessa asked me once how I knew to watch that carefully. The honest answer is I practiced. Not just the professional training, though that was real. I mean the daily practice of paying attention to people, to details, to the gap between what someone says and what they do. That habit doesn't come free. You build it over years, or you don't have it when you need it. What I want Tessa to carry from all of this isn't fear. It isn't suspicion. I told her that in the restaurant, and I meant every word. What I want her to carry is the understanding that clarity is something you cultivate, that seeing the world honestly, without flinching and without distortion, is a discipline, and that it is compatible with being warm-hearted and open. She was right to love openly. She was right to trust. The failure wasn't in her character. It was in the absence of a skill she simply hadn't been taught yet. I'm teaching her now, slowly, the way you teach anything worth knowing. Clarice Whitfield didn't have someone watching. That fact lives with me in a way I can't fully articulate. I don't know if I could have seen it in time if I'd been there. But I know that the cost of not paying attention is sometimes someone else's life. And that is a weight I don't put down easily. Tessa is alive. She's learning. On the steps outside that courthouse in January cold, she took my arm and we walked to the car, and it felt like something rebuilt from the foundation up. Not the same as before, not easier but solid. That's what I know how to do. Build things that hold.